Imagine a global market, right? And this market is projected to be worth over $424 billion by the year 2030.
Which is, I mean, that's just a massive
It's
number.
astronomical. And when we hear numbers that big, you usually think of, I don't know, aerospace engineering or like global telecommunications.
Yeah, semiconductor manufacturing, big tech, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But the industry we are diving into today doesn't manufacture microchips. It doesn't build airplanes.
No, not at all.
Its primary raw material is, well, it's human vulnerability. And its fundamental commodity is the legal severing of families.
Yeah, it is a really staggering reality to confront because we are looking at an economic engine that operates almost entirely in the shadows.
Right in plain sight, though.
Exactly. It's cloaked in the language of charity, social safety.
So welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to deconstruct a massive stack of forensic financial reports, audits, and sociological data. We're analyzing the global child welfare, adoption, and foster care systems.
And we are tracking how a statutory safety net, something that was ostensibly designed to catch people when they fall,
Right.
how that was mathematically and structurally morphed into a transnational market.
And we're doing this for you, the listener, because you are someone who wants to understand the hidden machinery of the world, right?
Right.
But without being overwhelmed by, like, dense academic jargon.
Nobody wants to read 1,000 pages of financial audits.
Right. So we are going to look at how public wealth and human trauma are being optimized, like literally mathematically optimized by private equity, algorithms, and global policies.
And to really comprehend a market of this magnitude, we have to pull the lens back.
Way back.
Because it is incredibly common, and I mean completely understandable, to focus on the individual tragic news stories we see in the media.
Right.
We tend to critique a specific, overwhelmed local agency.
Or we debate the actions of just a single social worker who made a bad call.
Exactly. But what's fascinating here is that to understand a $424 billion market, we must look beyond those local controversies. We have to map the exact financial architectures driving it globally.
The actual money pipeline.
We have to look at the bounties, the corporate debt loads, and the literal securitization of human lives.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I want to establish a boundary right up front for everyone listening. The sources we're looking at, they are not framing this as a critique of individual social workers on the ground.
No.
Most people who enter the field of social work do so out of a deep, genuine desire to help.
It's a grueling job.
It really is. So this isn't about individual malice. We are taking a purely forensic, structural look at the mass and the legislation. And to figure out how this massive global machine was built, we actually have to travel back to the United States.
To the late 1990s.
Right. We have to look at how incredibly well-intentioned legislation, like genuinely well-intentioned, accidentally laid the foundation for market weaponization.
Yeah, so we need to set the scene of what the child welfare system looked like prior to 1997. Because the system was functionally paralyzed by a crisis that experts back then called foster care drift.
Foster care drift.
Right. You had hundreds of thousands of children languishing indefinitely in temporary care, bouncing from one short-term foster placement to another, month after month, year after year.
And they weren't going back to their biological parents.
No, they were never returning home, but they were never being legally adopted either. They were effectively ghost children, just suspended in this bureaucratic gridlock.
And there was a massive philosophical tension at the time, right? Like lawmakers and the public felt the system had tilted way too far toward giving biological parents endless second, third, and fourth chances.
Right, to the point where kids were being repeatedly sent back into deeply unsafe environments. People were demanding a resolution.
They wanted finality.
They were demanding what the industry calls permanency. So, to force an end to this gridlock, the 105th Congress passed the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997.
Also known as SFA.
Right, SFA. And it is crucial to look at the political climate of this legislation. I mean, lawmakers didn't consciously convene to engineer an exploitative trafficking ring.
Obviously not.
This was an incredibly bipartisan effort during an era of really high political polarization.
Yeah, the numbers in the source material are wild. It was sponsored by Republican Representative Dave Camp. It was co-sponsored by Democrat Barbara Kennelly and Republican E. Clay Shaw.
You had backing from staunch conservatives like Mike DeWine, moderates like John Chafee, and liberal stalwarts like Jay Rockefeller.
It was everyone. In the House of Representatives, it passed 406 to 7.
And by unanimous consent in the Senate,
Bill Clinton signed it into law, and Hillary Clinton heavily championed it. And her explicit goal was to literally double adoptions within 5 years.
Right. Everyone from every corner of the political spectrum agreed this was the ultimate solution.
And yet, if we strictly analyze the mathematics, like the structural incentives of what they actually signed into law.
You see the creation of massive loopholes.
Yep.
ASFA introduced two primary mechanisms that completely altered the landscape of child welfare.
Oh, yeah.
The first mechanism was the creation of a strict federal timeline. The reports refer to it as the 15 of 22-month stopwatch.
Okay, explain that stopwatch. Like, how does it physically work?
Under SFA, if a child is in foster care for 15 out of the most recent 22 months, the state government is legally mandated to initiate a process called the Termination of Parental Rights, or TPR.
And TPR, the reports mention, they call it the civil death penalty, right?
In jurisprudential circles, yes, TPR is known as the civil death penalty.
The civil death penalty. I mean, we need to pause on that phrase. That is an incredibly heavy legal concept.
It is the absolute, permanent, and irreversible severance of all legal and biological ties between a parent and a child.
Wow.
Once the TPR is finalized legally, that parent is no longer related to that child. They become legal strangers.
Period.
And the stopwatch made this termination a mandatory ticking clock.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second here. If a child has been removed from a home because of, say, severe malicious abuse, isn't 15 months actually a really long time? Like, shouldn't we want a mandatory mechanism to sever those ties and get the kid into a safe, permanent adoptive home?
Well, yeah, and that was the exact logic of the lawmakers. The problem is that the system mathematically ignores the sociological reality of why most children enter care in the first place.
Which is?
The vast majority of removals are not for malicious physical abuse. They are for neglect. And in domestic triage systems, neglect is almost always deeply conflated with structural destitution.
You mean poverty?
I mean extreme poverty. So imagine a single mother whose child is removed because they are living in a car, an apartment with no heat.
Which the state categorizes as unsafe housing.
Right. To get her child back, the state gives her a case plan. She has to find a stable job, secure a safe apartment with a separate bedroom for the child, attend mandatory parenting classes twice a week, and submit to regular drug testing.
Okay, so the 15-month stopwatch starts ticking.
The timer starts. Now, consider that she lives in a banking desert with no access to credit.
Right.
She doesn't have a car, so she relies on underfunded public transit to get to these mandatory classes and drug tests.
Which takes hours.
Exactly. And she applies for a Section 8 housing voucher to afford that apartment. But the wait list for Section 8 in her city is 3 years long.
Wow. The math it's literally impossible.
The 15-month stopwatch penalizes structural destitution. It weaponizes time against poverty.
Because it doesn't care why you don't have the apartment.
Right. It doesn't matter if the mother has done everything in her power or if she's waiting on a bureaucratic housing voucher that takes 2 years to clear. At month 15, the alarm goes off.
The timer's up.
The state is required to file for the civil death penalty. The rights are terminated, and the child is completely severed from their biological origin.
And the sources show the demographic fallout of this is just staggering. Because poverty in the United States is highly racialized, right? So this stopwatch disproportionately destroys minority families.
Absolutely.
The statistical analysis reveals that Black children are 50% more likely and Native American children 3 times more likely to suffer permanent severance compared to white children.
It is a devastating sociological impact. But the stopwatch was only the first mechanism.
Right, there were 2.
The second mechanism ASFA introduced was the codification of federal bounty payments.
The bounties. This is where the financialization really begins.
ASF created the Adoption and Legal Guardianship Incentive Payments Program. It literally paid state governments a cash bounty for every single finalized adoption that exceeded their historical baseline.
Wait, a cash bounty?
Yes. The federal government would pay the state between $4,000 and $6,000 per child and up to $10,000 for special needs children.
Just for doing the paperwork.
For finalizing the adoption. Just to give you a sense of scale, between 1999 and 2014 alone, over $423 million was distributed in these specific bounties.
Okay, wait. Let me get this straight. The state takes the child, the stopwatch forces the termination of rights, and then the state gets a cash bonus from the federal government for finalizing the adoption.
That's the mechanism.
How is this not just paying a contractor to rush a job? It feels like we built an incentive structure that is completely blind to whether the family actually needed to be separated permanently.
Well, it is worse than that, actually, because the legislation is completely blind to long-term stability. The trigger for the financial payout is strictly the legal finalization of the adoption paperwork.
Right.
It ignores what happens the day after the check clears.
Okay, the sources detail something called the double bounty loophole, which absolutely blew my mind when I read it. Walk us through how a state can actually get paid twice for the same kid.
So imagine an adoption is finalized. The state collects its $4,000 bounty.
Check clears.
Check clears. But a year later, the adoption disrupts.
Meaning the adoptive family backs out.
Right. The adoptive family realizes they are completely unequipped to handle a child's complex, deep-seated trauma. So they return the child to state custody.
Which has to be a heartbreaking secondary trauma for that kid.
Immensely traumatic. But mathematically, the state simply places that child with a second adoptive family. They finalize a second set of adoption paperwork.
Oh, boy.
And because the system only tracks the legal event of an adoption, the state collects a second bounty.
You're kidding.
The system technically and mathematically rewards the failure of the initial placement.
So it's literally like, okay, it's like paying a contractor to build a bridge. The bridge collapsing a year later because it was rushed and poorly constructed. And the city just turning around and paying the exact same contractor a bonus to build it again.
That is exactly what it is.
It makes zero sense from a child welfare perspective.
But it makes perfect sense from a financial perspective. We have a system where the incentives are completely misaligned with human well-being, driven by a bounty system that scales up the faster you finalize separations.
Which naturally makes me wonder, how does an incentive structure like this scale up from state-level bounties to a $424 billion global market? Like, how does high finance, like Wall Street and private equity, look at this messy emotional safety net and figure out how to extract wealth from it?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the mechanisms of high finance. And the forensic review in our sources makes an incredibly chilling comparison.
Okay.
The child protection market replicates the exact financial architecture of the pre-2008 subprime mortgage banking sector.
The 2008 financial crisis, the housing crash that tanked the global economy.
Yes.
How on earth does child welfare map onto subprime mortgages?
The reports map this across 4 distinct structural dimensions. Let's look at the first dimension: guaranteed government backing.
Okay.
Remember the lead up to 2008. Government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac implicitly guaranteed the liquidity of the mortgage market.
Right. Banks felt safe issuing terrible loans because they believed the government would always backstop the risk, the whole too big to fail mentality.
Exactly. Now, in the child welfare market, the state has a non-negotiable statutory mandate to house children it removes from their parents. A government cannot legally leave a ward of the state out on the street.
They have to put them somewhere.
Right. Therefore, the government acts as a default-proof payer. If you are a private equity firm that buys a residential group home for foster youth, you are completely insulated from standard macroeconomic downturns.
Oh, wow.
Whether there is a recession, inflation, or a stock market crash, the state must pay your daily fee. The revenue is guaranteed.
Okay, so the money literally never stops flowing.
Yeah.
What is the second dimension?
Dimension 2 is perverse incentives and moral hazard. In the mortgage crisis, loan originators were paid based on the sheer volume of loans they wrote.
Right, their commission was completely divorced from whether the borrower could actually afford the monthly payments.
Yes. They were incentivized to write as many loans as possible, regardless of the destruction it caused down the line.
And how does that apply to a foster agency?
Well, in the U.S., for example, private agencies are often compensated through open-ended federal entitlements. These are known as Title IV-E funding.
Okay, Title IV-E.
And they are paid on a per-child, per-day basis. So if you run a private foster care facility, your revenue is directly tied to your bed occupancy rate.
Which means if you do your job well and you heal the family and the child goes back home, you lose money.
Reunification instantly severs your revenue stream.
That is sick.
The financial model fundamentally optimizes for maximizing the length of an out-of-home stay. That is the very definition of a moral hazard. It makes keeping a child in care far more profitable than resolving the family's crisis.
That brings us to the third dimension. In 2008, the credit rating agencies completely failed to assess the real risk. Right? They were stamping AAA ratings on absolute garbage.
That is the illusion of uncorrelated risk. In 2008, the rating agencies assumed that a mortgage default in a suburb in Florida had absolutely no correlation to a mortgage default in a suburb in Nevada.
They thought they were isolated events.
Right. They ignored systemic macroeconomic shocks that would take down the whole system simultaneously. Today, child protection agencies increasingly rely on algorithmic triage tools to assess domestic neglect.
We're talking about predictive AI and data algorithms deciding if a child should be removed?
Yes, these algorithms scrape data points to calculate a risk score for a family, but they assess neglect in an absolute vacuum.
What do you mean?
They fail to recognize that a local factory closing down, or severe housing deficits, or a spike in inflation are highly correlated drivers of family instability.
Oh, I see.
The algorithm doesn't see a town devastated by a recession. It just sees a sudden spike in mothers who can't afford groceries. It mathematically conflates systemic poverty with individual neglect.
And by doing so?
By doing so, the algorithm ensures a continuous, steady supply of raw material to feed the market.
Calling children raw material is horrifying. But if we follow the cold logic of the market, that is exactly what they are here.
It is.
You have guaranteed government money, perverse incentives to keep the beds full, and algorithms functioning as an automated supply chain manager providing the inventory.
Which leaves the final piece of the 2008 puzzle.
Right. How are they securitizing this?
That is the fourth dimension. Asset-backed securitization via social impact bonds, or SIBs.
SIBs.
They are sometimes marketed under the friendlier name pay-for-success contracts.
Okay, I've heard of these. It's when a government wants to launch a social program, but doesn't want to risk taxpayer money up front, so they get private investors to front the cash.
Correct. Massive institutional investors, including entities like Goldman Sachs, provide the initial capital for state social interventions.
Right.
The contract stipulates that if the state hits specific predetermined metrics by a certain date, the government will use taxpayer money to repay the investors their principal, plus a substantial profit return.
See, on paper, that doesn't sound inherently evil. It sounds like private money funding a public good. If the social program works, the investors make a profit. If it fails, the investors take the hit, not the taxpayer.
It sounds innovative until you critically examine the metrics.
Okay, hit me.
How do you measure the holistic healing of a deeply traumatized child? You can't put that on a spreadsheet. So these contracts frequently reduce success to incredibly simplistic operational targets.
Like what?
For example, the metric for a payout might just be vacating a foster bed or closing a case file within 6 months.
Okay, so if the goal is just to empty a bed to trigger the multi-million-dollar payout,
Hmm.
what stops the private agency from just taking the absolute easiest cases?
Nothing stops them. In fact, the structure demands it. It severely incentivizes a practice known in economics as cream skimming.
I want to make sure I understand this. Cream skimming means targeting the cream of the crop, like the easiest demographic.
Exactly. Private entities explicitly target the most easily treatable demographics to mathematically guarantee their financial yields. If you are an investor, you want absolute certainty that you will get your return.
Right, you're not doing this for charity.
So the private agencies deliberately ignore the severely marginalized youth, the teenagers with complex co-occurring traumas, severe behavioral issues, or profound disabilities.
Because those kids are expensive to treat.
Yeah.
And they might not meet the metric by the deadline, so you lose your bonus.
Precisely. Those children represent a fundamental threat to the profit margin. So the private sector skims the easy cases, collects the profit, and leaves the most traumatized, difficult, and expensive cases for the underfunded public state system to handle.
Wow.
The traditional social impact bond socializes all the human risk while completely privatizing the financial savings.
Let me put myself in the shoes of a private facility manager for a second. I'm looking at my budget. I have access to an open-ended Title V entitlement that pays me every single day a child is sitting in my facility.
Yes.
And on the other side, there's a capped Title V fund that the government provides for family preservation to pay for things like rent assistance or therapy to keep the child safely at home.
Right.
The math overwhelmingly dictates that keeping the child in my facility is cheaper and endlessly more profitable than doing the grueling, complex work of stabilizing the parents.
The system is operating flawlessly according to its financial design. It is designed to maximize the capitalization of human vulnerability.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Once we establish that the system functions perfectly as a wealth extraction machine, we have to look at how transnational private capital deploys this playbook in the real world.
Because it doesn't just stay in one place.
Exactly. Private equity firms don't just sit in one place. They cross borders, they study domestic laws, and they adapt their strategies to exploit whatever local vulnerabilities exist. Let's look at how this plays out across different countries, starting with the United States.
Okay, so in the United States, private equity firms like Bain Capital, Centerbridge, the Vistria Group, and Partners Group rely on a strategy called a roll-up.
A roll-up.
They specifically target that decentralized, open-ended entitlement structure of the Title IV funding we just discussed. A roll-up occurs when a massive private equity firm acquires a central platform company and then systematically buys up multiple fragmented, independent regional behavioral health and youth providers.
They act like a vacuum cleaner,
Yeah,
just sucking up all the small regional agencies until they control the whole geographic area.
exactly. They consolidate regional market power so they can dictate pricing to the local government. But the true wealth extraction occurs through a mechanism called a dividend recapitalization.
Okay, the sources explain this, and my jaw hit the floor. As I understand it, a dividend recapitalization is essentially like buying a house in cash, immediately going to a bank to take out a massive, toxic second mortgage on that house, pocketing the cash from the mortgage into your own bank account, and then walking away, leaving the house to figure out how to pay the monthly bill. Is that accurate?
That is a perfect analogy. The private equity firm purchases the child welfare agency. Because the PE firm owns the agency, it forces the agency to take out a massive corporate loan from a bank.
Right.
The PE firm then uses the cash from that new debt to pay itself a massive immediate dividend. They recoup their initial investment instantly and then some.
And they just leave.
They leave the local agency drowning in unsustainable corporate debt.
We have to give the specific examples from the text because the numbers are sickening. The reports detail a move by Centerbridge and the Vistria Group in 2024. They acquired a care company called Help at Home. They loaded $1.5 billion in debt onto the company, specifically so they could pay themselves a $262.6 million debt-funded dividend,
And Bain Capital did the exact same thing to CRC Health Group.
saddling them with $600 million in debt.
Now consider the real-world consequences for the agency on the ground. To service that astronomical debt, the agency must drastically cut operational costs.
How do they even do that?
They slash staff. They replace experienced, highly trained therapeutic workers with cheap, uncredentialed labor. They defer necessary maintenance on their residential facilities.
All while making absolutely sure the beds stay full so the government daily payouts keep coming in to pay off the bank loan.
Exact.
The kids are essentially working off the private equity firm's debt just by existing in a compromised facility.
The human impact is a direct, measurable, and intentional reduction in the quality of care for deeply traumatized youth, all to service-engineered corporate debt. But, as you noted, capital is adaptable. The roll-up strategy works in the U.S. because of open-ended federal entitlements. If we look at the United Kingdom, the funding structure is entirely different, so the private equity playbook changes.
Right. They pivot.
They don't exploit federal entitlements in the UK, they exploit statutory municipal panic.
The UK situation is like a slow-motion car crash. Local councils, which are basically municipalities in the UK, are legally mandated by domestic statute to house vulnerable children. They have no choice.
None.
But for the last decade, the central government has imposed severe austerity measures. They have slashed the budgets of these local councils. So the municipalities legally have to buy a service, but they literally have no money to pay for it.
And private equity recognized this immediate structural vulnerability. Private equity-backed independent fostering agencies systematically bought up the physical infrastructure.
The actual homes.
Today, private providers run 84% of all children's homes in England.
It's a hostage situation. It's like being trapped in a hospital where you have a deadly disease and you legally have to buy the medicine to survive.
Right.
But the pharmacy's owned by a private equity firm that knows you have no other options, so they raise the price by 1,000% every single day. Eventually, the patient, or in this case, the whole town, goes completely bankrupt just trying to pay the bill.
It is a permanent captive seller's market, and it results in unchecked price gouging. Let's look at the statistics from the forensic audit. The average cost to house a single child has surged to £318,400 per year.
That is over £300,000 for one child for 1 year.
And the average profit margin for the 15 largest private providers is 22.6%. We're seeing cases where councils are being charged weekly fees of £10,000.
$10,000 a week.
Meaning a municipality is paying over £500,000 a year for a single child's placement.
And the councils can't say no. So what happens when a town runs out of money?
Under UK law, local authorities cannot legally operate at a deficit. When the exorbitant social care fees exceed their total municipal income, they are forced to issue what is called a Section 114 notice.
Which is?
It is the municipal equivalent of declaring total bankruptcy.
The sources list the towns that have been completely broken by this. Northamptonshire, Croydon, Thurrock, Woking, Birmingham, Nottingham. And when a city issues a Section 114 notice, it means all non-statutory spending is immediately frozen.
Which means the entire community lifeline is gutted. Libraries are closed, public parks are unmaintained, preventative children's centers are shut down, waste collection is reduced.
They just stop picking up the trash.
Essentially, yes, the municipality strips itself down to the absolute bare minimum, cannibalizing its own infrastructure just to pay these private equity profit margins.
And here is the ultimate insult. That tax money, the money drained from these bankrupt towns, isn't even staying in the UK economy.
No, it isn't. Transnational capital markets are designed to evade taxation. The reports trace these immense profits being routed directly into offshore tax havens, such as the Cayman Islands.
The Cayman Islands, of course.
Between 2021 and 2024, private care companies operating in just 3 specific UK regions extracted $256 million in sheer profit. More than a third of that wealth was captured by firms with offshore parent companies.
So it's just gone.
It is a direct, unilateral transfer of wealth from British taxpayers and highly vulnerable children into untraceable offshore accounts.
It is breathtaking in its efficiency. So that is the U.S. debt trap and the U.K. municipal extortion. What about Australia? How does the extraction work there?
In Australia, the extraction vector is primarily through real estate exploitation.
Real estate.
The sources detail a fascinating and deeply concerning forensic audit known as Project Mariba. This audit investigated a non-governmental organization called Allambie Care, operating in New South Wales. This NGO was receiving approximately $70 million annually in public taxpayer funds to provide out-of-home care for youth.
A supposedly charitable NGO.
Yes. But the audit revealed a sophisticated scheme. Senior executives of this NGO were privately purchasing residential properties under their own names or private LLCs.
Okay.
They would then turn around and lease those exact same properties back to their own NGO to be used as emergency youth accommodations.
They were playing both sides of the transaction. They're the landlord and the tenant.
And they controlled the price. They were leasing their private properties to the NGO at a 20% premium over fair market rental rates.
Unbelievable.
Because the NGO's operating costs were fully funded by the government, the taxpayers were unknowingly subsidizing guaranteed inflated rental yields for the executives' private real estate portfolios.
It's basically money laundering through real estate under the guise of child welfare. And the audit found they went even further, right?
They did.
They would illicitly charge the government for major capital improvements on those private properties. They billed the taxpayer for installing new HVAC systems, laying down new carpets, and upgrading the stormwater drainage. The executives increased the equity value of their personal real estate using public funds meant for vulnerable youth.
All while the youth themselves, who in Australia are disproportionately Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, were being supervised by cheap, uncredentialed labor hire staff.
Because the operational funds were being siphoned off.
Into property improvements. It was a masterclass in real estate extraction masquerading as social care.
Just a total grift. We have one more country to look at in this section, Canada. The sources outline how Canada's extraction model didn't rely on real estate or private equity loopholes. It was built on systemic discrimination and explicitly mathematically rigged funding directives.
The Canadian framework is a stark example of how bureaucratic funding formulas can drive mass child removal. The sociological data points to what is referred to as the Millennium Scoop.
The Millennium Scoop.
Currently, Indigenous youth comprise a staggering 53.7% of all children in government care in Canada, despite representing only 5% of the total Canadian population.
That level of overrepresentation isn't an accident, it's structural. And the sources point directly to a federal policy called Directive 20-1.
Directive 20-1 was mathematically engineered to penalize family preservation on First Nations reserves.
Oh, so?
The government systematically and deliberately underfunded preventative community-based services. If a community asked for funds for housing repairs, addiction counseling, or family support to keep a child safely at home, the funding was denied or capped at completely inadequate levels. But if an agency physically apprehended an Indigenous child and placed them into the foster care system, the state fully reimbursed all the costs of that apprehension and out-of-home care.
The cruelty of that math is astounding. To get the resources you need to respond to a family in crisis, you legally had to take the child away.
In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal definitively ruled on this. They declared that this specific funding formula created a direct mathematical incentive to bring children into care.
Because it was the only way to get the money.
The system actively denied families equitable prevention services, directly widening the historical traumas inflicted by the residential school system.
So whether we are looking at the US, the UK, Australia, or Canada, we see modern capital acting like an apex predator. It learns, it adapts, and it finds the weakest point in the system.
It absolutely does.
It preys on open checkbooks, municipal panic, property loopholes, and systemic racism. But one of the most profound insights from our sources is that this physical and legal movement of children for financial or geopolitical gain is not a new invention.
No, not at all.
Modern private equity is simply utilizing historical biopolitical blueprints that have existed for centuries.
We cannot understand the modern market without understanding the historical architecture of coercion it is built upon. The contemporary complex relies on established models of mass child movement and identity erasure.
Let's start with Australia and the concept of the clean break.
Right. During the era of the stolen generations in Australia, the government forcibly removed Aboriginal children from their families to force cultural assimilation. To justify this, they established a foundational clean break theory.
Now, clean break.
This theory promoted total adoption secrecy and the absolute suppression of a child's birth identity. The state believed that for the new placement to succeed, the child's past had to be entirely eradicated.
And we can mathematically measure the destruction that theory caused. The intergenerational trauma of that erasure is statistically quantifiable today.
Yes, the metrics are very clear.
The sources note that descendants of the stolen generations are 1.9 times as likely to have experienced violence and 1.3 times as likely to report poor mental health. The trauma trickles down to the next generation. Their children are 4.5 times more likely to miss school without permission. You cannot erase a child's history without causing permanent psychological fractures.
The British Empire utilized a similar biopolitical blueprint. They recognized that child welfare could be weaponized as a mechanism for imperial social engineering. Over several decades, the British government sent roughly 100,000 British children, many from impoverished backgrounds, to settler colonies like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada.
And the propaganda surrounding this was so insidious, they sold it to the British public as a grand humanitarian effort. They said they were rescuing poor children and sending them overseas to live fabulous new lives in the sun. But what was the actual reality?
The reality was macroeconomic exploitation. The colonies needed cheap, manageable labor to build their infrastructure. These children were placed in massive, austere institutions and utilized as a free labor force.
Unbelievable.
It was the mass extraction of vulnerable youth to serve the economic development of the empire, cloaked in the language of rescue.
And as we moved into the 20th century, that blueprint evolved. During the Cold War, children were increasingly treated as geopolitical assets. The sources heavily detail two specific operations. We'll talk about Operation Peter Pan.
Between 1960 and 1962, over 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children were clandestinely evacuated to the United States. The public framing was that this was a desperate mission to save children from communist indoctrination under Fidel Castro.
But the forensic analysis looks at who was actually funding the operation.
This mass evacuation was heavily funded by private donations from massive Western corporations. Specifically, corporations whose lucrative Cuban assets had just been nationalized by Castro's government companies like Esso, Standard Oil, and Freeport Sulphur.
Why would massive oil and sulfur companies care about evacuating children? What is the geopolitical play there?
Destabilization. These corporations specifically restricted the evacuation visas to children aged 5 to 18. By deliberately facilitating the removal of the children, they aimed to induce panic and dissent among the Cuban middle class.
Oh, wow.
The psychological calculation was that parents, desperate to be reunited with the children who had been flown to Miami, would violently oppose the Castro regime. It was the weaponization of family separation to protect corporate assets.
That is incredibly dark. And then, a little over a decade later, we see a similar dynamic in Vietnam with Operation Baby Lift.
In 1975, during the chaotic fall of Saigon, approximately 3,300 children were evacuated from South Vietnam to the United States and allied countries. Once again, it was framed exclusively to the Western public as a humanitarian rescue of destitute war orphans.
But they weren't all orphans.
Subsequent legal investigations revealed a profound tragedy. Many of these children were not orphans at all. They had been placed in temporary emergency care facilities by their biological parents who were desperately seeking safety for their children during heavy bombing campaigns.
So they were basically in a daycare.
Effectively, yes. They had no intention of permanently surrendering their parental rights.
The sources mention a specific landmark case, Hun Tian v. Levi. When the war ended, these biological parents came looking for their kids. They fought desperately to get them back. What happened?
They encountered an impenetrable legal wall. By the time the parents tracked their children down in the United States, the children had been placed with American adoptive families, and the U.S. judicial system overwhelmingly ruled in favor of the adoptive parent.
They just said no.
The courts permanently sealed the adoption records, completely severing the biological families based on the premise that the children were better off in affluent Western homes.
This perfectly transitions into the underlying legal technology that makes this kind of permanent severance possible. Because to completely erase a family, you need laws that allow the state to alter reality.
Yes.
The sources call it the biopolitical technology of the as-if-born-to doctrine. I need you to explain what this doctrine is, because it feels like something out of a dystopian novel.
It is a foundational pillar of modern child welfare law, formalized through historical instruments like the 1917 Minnesota Children's Code. The as-if-born-to doctrine legally mandates that upon the finalization of an adoption, the child becomes the legal offspring of the adoptive parents, exactly as if they had been biologically born to them in lawful wedlock.
It dictates that the law must pretend biology didn't happen.
What originated over a century ago as a progressive attempt to erase the crushing social stigma of illegitimacy has evolved into a mechanism of total genealogical erasure. Because to enforce that legal fiction, to pretend the child was born to entirely different people, the state must actively hide the truth.
And they do that through paperwork.
The state permanently seals the original birth certificate. It vanishes into a vault. The adult adoptee is treated as a perpetual minor under the law, legally barred from accessing their own historical origins. Then the state issues an amended birth certificate.
Which is, logically speaking, a forgery.
It is a state-sanctioned alteration of a vital historical record. It physically replaces the names of the biological parents with the names of the adoptive parents, asserting an event that never physically occurred.
That's wild.
This raises an important question regarding international human rights. How does a sovereign state possess the authority to legally obliterate a citizen's historical identity? Because this systemic erasure fundamentally violates international law.
Specifically, which law?
Specifically, it is in direct contravention of Article 8 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which guarantees the inherent right of every child to preserve their identity, name, and family relations without unlawful interference.
The downstream impacts of this legislated erasure are staggering to consider. Because the system legally pretends the trauma of separation didn't happen, it creates a massive blind spot in society.
A huge one.
The reports highlight a forensic review of vocational education and training frameworks in Australia. They looked at the curriculum for mental health workers, community service providers, and social workers.
They found an absolute systemic erasure of adoptees within the educational frameworks. The trauma of adoption isn't taught. The only explicit national training reference to the word adoption in the entire Australian framework is found in a Certificate 4 in the greyhound racing industry.
Let that sink in. They mandate training for the adoption of racing dogs, but there is a total absence of mandatory training regarding the lifelong psychosocial impacts of genealogical severance for human beings.
Which constitutes a severe form of indirect discrimination. If the professionals tasked with supporting public mental health have zero formal competency in the trauma of adoption, the system is fundamentally incapable of healing the trauma it continues to create.
This historical architecture, the biopolitics, the sealed records, the altered birth certificates, it provides the perfect legal cover for the most extreme and terrifying iteration of the current complex, the transnational supply chain and the manufacturing of demand. We are moving now into what the sources call the intercountry adoption heptagon.
As domestic regulatory scrutiny gradually tightens in affluent countries like the US and the UK, the child welfare market routinely expands its operations into the global south.
To find more inventory.
Exactly. It relies on severe global wealth disparities to shift what the market views as inventory. The entire model is based on extracting children from marginalized origin communities and transferring them to affluent adoptive parents in the global north.
And to understand it as a market, we have to look at the pricing tiers. The system is completely stratified by desirability. The report breaks down the baseline costs. Domestic foster care adoptions, which involve older children or sibling groups from the state system, run from $0 to $5,000, heavily subsidized by the government.
Right.
Private domestic infant adoption healthy newborns within the U.S. runs between $20,000 and $45,000. But intercountry adoption is the premium tier. It ranges from $30,000 to $60,000 or significantly more.
And because of those premium price tags, the gross revenues for the agencies facilitating this trade are astronomical. A review of IRS filings and the sources reveals that some Hague-accredited adoption agencies are recording gross revenues as high as $115 million.
But here is the fundamental problem with a market reliant on $115 million of revenue. You need a constant, uninterrupted supply of product. You need children. Which brings us to the foundational myth of the entire transnational market, the myth of the orphan.
The Western public is conditioned to believe that the supply of children available for intercountry adoption is a natural, tragic demographic phenomenon. We assume these are children left entirely without parents due to famine, war, or mass abandonment.
But the sociological data proves the exact opposite. Up to 80% of children residing in global orphanages today have at least one living, locatable parent.
Let me repeat that because it is crucial. Up to 80% of institutionalized children have a living parent.
80%.
And the data shows these parents are overwhelmingly capable of caregiving if they were simply provided with basic, sustainable social support. The children are not orphans, they are economic refugees from their own families.
And the sources show that Western capital actually creates the institutionalization it claims to be rescuing children from. It is a manufactured crisis.
The correlation is undeniable. The institutionalization of children rises in direct proportion to the influx of foreign capital.
You mean the more money we send, the more orphanages pop up?
Exactly. In Cambodia, over a 5-year period, there was a staggering 75% increase in the number of residential care institutions. Yet, there was absolutely zero demographic rise in parentless children in the country.
So where were the kids coming from?
The orphanages were built because foreign donors were paying for them, so they had to find kids to fill them. In Uganda, the institutionalized child population surged from 1,000 to 55,000 children, occurring against a backdrop of actively decreasing true orphanhood.
Because it's a lucrative business model. If you build an orphanage and get Western donors to fund it, you have to fill the beds. The reports detail how this extraction happens on the ground. They use local middlemen.
Right, the facilitators.
In Latin America, they are called jauduadores. These individuals actively recruit children. They go into deeply impoverished rural communities and target desperate parents. They lure the kids away with false promises, telling the parents that if they send their child to this institution, the child will receive an elite Western education and return to lift the family out of poverty.
The parents believe they are sending their child to a boarding school. But once the child is in the institution, the agency creates fraudulent documentation to legally transform the child into a paper orphan, severing the parents' rights without their knowledge.
And then the industry leverages voluntourism to maximize profits. They fly in Western tourists and church groups who want to help orphans.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it.
The agencies force the children to perform their impoverishment. The kids are forbidden from wearing shoes, or they are forced to perform cultural dances for the tourist, specifically designed to maximize donor sympathy and secure massive funding streams. It is theatrical exploitation.
Which brings us to the intersection of this market and international jurisprudence. Because when you combine fraudulent documentation, extreme financial incentives, and the transnational transfer of minors, you are no longer just dealing with a flawed social service.
Right.
You are intersecting with the legal definitions of human trafficking.
So what does this all mean legally, if these kids aren't actually orphans and large sums of money are changing hands?
We must look at the United Nations Palermo Protocol of 2000, which is the foundational international treaty against human trafficking. Generally, to prove adult trafficking, you must establish 3 elements: the act like transporting a person, the means, the use of force, fraud, or coercion, and the purpose of exploitation.
Okay, act means purpose.
However, Article 3C of the Palermo Protocol contains a critical legal distinction. It explicitly removes the means requirement when the victim is under 18 years of age.
Meaning you don't have to prove force or fraud if it's a child.
Correct. A minor fundamentally lacks the legal capacity to consent to their own commodification. Therefore, the recruitment, transportation, or transfer of a child for improper financial gain inherently meets the international legal definition of trafficking, regardless of whether the parents were coerced or tricked.
That is a terrifying implication for the industry. The Palermo Protocol legally categorizes a vast chunk of legalized intercountry adoption as institutionalized trafficking, simply because a minor cannot consent to their own sale and massive financial gain is clearly involved.
And we are not speaking in theoretical abstractions. The sources detail highly organized criminal networks operating within this legal gray area. For instance, an Indonesian syndicate operating between Bandung and Singapore was recently dismantled.
What were they doing?
From 2023 to 2026, they actively targeted expectant mothers facing severe financial hardship. They paid the mothers roughly $1,300 for their infants. The syndicate then trafficked the children and sold them to affluent buyers for up to $14,000.
It's just a margin play for them.
And appallingly, the syndicate aggressively selected and priced the infants based on physical attractiveness and skin tone.
It is the literal commodification of human beings. And because the risk of this exploitation is entirely unmanageable when market forces are applied to human vulnerability, we are finally seeing sovereign states wake up and shut it down.
We are witnessing a global wave of moratoriums. In 2024, China abruptly and permanently terminated its international adoption program after 30 years of operation, closing off one of the largest supply chains in the world. The Netherlands implemented a total ban following the release of the Joustra report, a government inquiry which uncovered systemic abuses, structural corruption, and false history spanning decades. South Korea, which historically supplied hundreds of thousands of children to the West, now aims to reduce overseas adoptions to absolute zero by 2029, following formal admissions of state-sanctioned fraud and identity falsification.
Okay. We have mapped a $424.5 billion global market that treats families like inventory, securitizes trauma, bankrupts municipalities, and fundamentally meets the international definition of trafficking.
It's a lot to take in.
With the true scale of this exposed, it feels completely overwhelming. The initial instinct is to say, burn it all down, ban private equity from social care tomorrow. But the sources are very clear. We cannot simply flip a switch and turn it off. The expert reports describe demanding immediate, unplanned deprivatization as being like turning off gravity.
It is a perfect metaphor. If you suddenly ban all private providers tomorrow, the system physically collapses. You would cause catastrophic, immediate service disruptions for the hundreds of thousands of highly vulnerable youth who are currently suspended within the system.
They need a bed tonight.
They rely on these beds tonight. We cannot destroy the infrastructure without having a replacement. We need concrete, transitional, economic exit strategies.
We have to use the very tools of financialization to enact structural remediation. We have to beat the market at its own game. The reports outline 3 specific, brilliant transitional strategies. The first is restructuring social impact bonds, or SIBs, for family preservation.
We discussed earlier how traditional SEBs incentivize cream skimming and maximize bed occupancy, but the financial instrument itself isn't the problem. The metrics are the problem.
Okay, so we changed the metrics.
Governments can legally restructure SIB contracts to restrict investor yields so that private returns are based exclusively on structural stability.
How does that work in practice?
Instead of paying investors a multi-million-dollar dividend when a foster bed is occupied or a file is swiftly closed, the dividend is held back. It is paid out only when a highly complex family achieves sustainable housing, biological preservation, and demonstrably avoids the child welfare system entirely for a predetermined number of years.
That is incredible. You harness the raw greed of the market. You tie profit directly to the permanent avoidance of family separation. Private equity wants a return on investment, so you force them to redirect that aggressive, ruthless financial efficiency toward holistic community stabilization. If they don't fix the family's poverty, they don't get paid.
Exactly.
And this isn't just theory, right? The sources mention highly successful pilot programs.
The Newpin Social Benefit Bond in New South Wales, Australia, is a phenomenal template. It was aimed explicitly at preventing children from entering care and restoring those already removed. In its first operational year, it successfully restored 28 children to their biological families, prevented 10 highly at-risk families from entering the system entirely, and still delivered a 7.5% return to its private investors. The capital worked for the community.
And there's an example regarding housing, too, because housing is such a massive driver of neglect charges.
Yes. The Preservation of Affordable Housing, or POAH, issued a $75 million sustainability bond. This capital was dedicated exclusively to creating and preserving affordable homes that support economic security for vulnerable families.
That's huge.
In Santa Clara County, Project Welcome Home utilized $7 million in seed money from investors to permanently house 150 to 200 chronically homeless individuals. By stabilizing their housing, they reduced the county's emergency service interactions and costs by 70%. The investors profited by solving the root cause of the crisis.
That leads perfectly into the second exit strategy, which addresses how governments fundamentally allocate money. The sources call it the Canadian Settlement Blueprint, and it introduces this concept of inverse funding.
This is perhaps the most significant macroeconomic shift in child welfare history. Following decades of relentless legal advocacy by Indigenous leaders like Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, the Canadian government finally agreed to a landmark $40 billion settlement.
$40 billion.
They formally acknowledged that their funding structure, specifically Directive 20-1, explicitly incentivized the mass removal of Indigenous children.
But the brilliance of this settlement isn't just the apology or the total dollar amount. It's the financial architecture of how the money is spent.
Precisely. Of that $40 billion, $23.34 billion via the final settlement agreement, which is nearly 60% of the total, is not paid out as individual damages. It is legally ring-fenced, strictly for long-term structural reform and ongoing system prevention over the next 5 years.
They lock the money away so politicians can't reallocate it to other projects.
And it legally establishes what economists call an inverse funding formula. Under this reform, the government legally guarantees $2,500 Canadian dollars in preventive care per child. This ensures that massive capital is deployed to address the root social determinants of health, such as severe housing deficits, food insecurity, and access to clean water before a crisis necessitates state apprehension.
They flip the script. Instead of fully funding the foster care bed after the family collapses, they legally mandate funding the family so they don't collapse in the first place.
It explicitly dictates in law that poverty can no longer be utilized as a justification for apprehension. By guaranteeing preservation funding, it fundamentally starves the extractive pipeline of its raw material. If the families are stable, there is no inventory for the private market to extract.
Which brings us to the third and final strategy. We have to deal with those private equity firms draining the municipal budgets, like the ones causing bankruptcies in the UK. We need to implement profit caps and workforce literacy.
The UK Competition and Markets Authority conducted a massive review of the sector and recommended the implementation of strict profit caps on private providers.
And the elegance of this solution is amazing to me. You don't even have to write a law legally banning private equity firms from operating in the sector. You don't have to fight them in court to kick them out. You just cap the profit margins at, say, 5%. Because of their dividend recapitalizations, these firms are carrying billions of dollars in toxic corporate debt. If you cap their profits, they can no longer generate enough cash flow to service their debt loads.
The extractive model simply collapses on itself. By limiting the yield, the highly leveraged firms are mathematically forced to exit the market. They will sell off their assets to nonprofits or back to the state, returning pricing power to the municipalities without causing an overnight system collapse.
But we also have to fix the people inside the system, not just the money.
That is the workforce literacy component. We must radically retrain the vocational workforce in trauma literacy to stop the systemic erasure we discussed regarding adoptees. If the frontline workforce, the social workers, the therapists, the judges, truly understands the lifelong psychosocial impacts of permanent family separation, they will naturally prioritize biological preservation. They will fight to keep families together rather than unknowingly acting as the administrative gears in an extractive machine.
We have covered an immense landscape today, mapping the architecture of a hidden $424 billion economy. We started in the 1990s, looking at how the well-intentioned SFA legislation accidentally weaponized time against poverty with its 15-month stopwatches and double bounties. We examined how this system perfectly mirrors the 2008 financial crisis, securitizing human trauma through perverse incentives and cream-skimming SIBs.
We tracked the global private equity playbook, from dividend recapitalization debt traps in the U.S. to municipal extortion and Section 114 bankruptcies in the U.K., real estate laundering in Australia, and the mathematically rigged removal of Indigenous youth in Canada.
We looked backward at the historical biopolitics, the stolen generations, Operation Peter Pan, and the chilling as-if born to doctrine that uses forged birth certificates to erase identities. We unpack the institutionalized trafficking of the intercountry adoption heptagon, exposing the myth of the orphan and the exploitation of the Palermo Protocol. And finally, we looked at the concrete financial exit strategies, inverse funding, profit caps, and restructured SIBs that tie profit to preservation.
It's an overwhelming amount of information, but it's crucial.
You, listening to this, are now armed with a profound systemic understanding of how this machinery operates. You can see the math behind the tragedy. But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought extrapolated purely from the data we've analyzed today. Earlier, the expert noted that algorithmic triage tools are currently being used to assess domestic neglect in a vacuum. These algorithms already mathematically conflate poverty with neglect to ensure a steady supply of inventory for the market.
As we rapidly transition into an era where artificial intelligence increasingly dictates municipal budgets, analyzes risk, and automates these very triage systems, what happens when the uncorrelated risk of the child welfare market becomes fully automated?
If we don't implement these inverse funding architectures and profit caps immediately, will AI simply mathematically perfect the family separation industrial complex? Will it optimize the extraction of vulnerable children at a speed and scale that human regulators can't even audit, let alone stop? We've shown you the hidden blueprints of the system. The question now is whether we change the math to prioritize preservation or allow the algorithms to maximize the capitalization of human trauma. Keep questioning the architectures around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.